Hello, welcome to the new museum. Woo! My name's Alethea Rockwell. I'm the Keith Haring Director of Education and Public Engagement here. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you to tonight's program, Atmospheres, Artists on Feminism and the Environment. So I'll start with the land acknowledgement to recognize that the new museum is on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples, the original inhabitants of Manhattan. And as we gather here tonight, we begin by paying our respects to the Lenape, past, present, and future. So tonight's program is organized in conjunction with our current exhibition, Judy Chicago Herstory, curated by Massimiliano Gioni, Gary Carrion Moriari, Margot Norton, and Madeline Weisberg. And we're focusing tonight specifically on Chicago's Atmospheres works, which are a series of performances initially realized in various Californian landscapes in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which involved often nude performers coated in brightly colored paint and billowing smoke meant to soften or feminize the landscape. So for this conversation, we've invited artists who work with and within the natural world to use the Atmospheres works as a starting point from which to discuss the intersections of feminism and environmentalism in artistic practice today. We're so grateful to have curator and writer Candice Hopkins here as moderator. Candice, yeah, we can clap for her. Candice is a citizen of the Carcross Tagish First Nation. She lives in Red Hook, New York, and she's the executive director of the Forge Project. As the senior curator for the 2019 and 2022 Toronto Biennials, Candice curated Chicago's Atmospheres works, and she also commissioned her latest smoke sculpture. Candice also contributed an essay on these works to the exhibition catalog for our show here at the museum. And she'll be joined in conversation with two incredible artists who really hardly need any introduction from me. Torkwase Dyson, a painter who works across multiple mediums to explore the continuity between ecology, infrastructure, and architecture. And Jonas, who works across video, performance, installation, sound, text, and sculpture, and whose experiments from the 1960s and 70s continue to have an enormous impact on contemporary art. So Candice will start with an introduction to the Atmospheres series, and then she'll be joined by Torkwase and Joan, who will show some of their own works and join Candice in conversation. There will be time at the end for questions from all of you, so you can think about your questions. And the exhibition's open until 9 p.m. tonight, so I encourage you to stay and go up to the galleries afterwards. And please come back. The next program in this series for the exhibition is on January 11th, 2024. And it will feature three writers responding to Chicago's show: the poet Simone White, scholar Sophie Lewis, and novelist Kate Zimbreno. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly thank the new museum education staff who makes these programs happen, Austin D. Bowes and Derek Wright. Thank you. And I also want to thank our speakers, most of all, Candice, Torkwase, and Joan, for being here, for sharing your work with us. I'm very grateful to you. And thank you to Judy Chicago. She's not here with us tonight, but I'll thank her anyways for all the opportunities that her exhibition has opened up for us here at the new museum. So with that, I'm so pleased to pass things over to Candice Hopkins.
Thanks for this invitation to the new museum. It's a real honor to be in dialogue with Joan and Torkwase this evening, and also to be in dialogue with Judy's Atmospheres. And I thought one way of setting a kind of environment for what we'll be discussing tonight is to share a bit of an overview and a history of the smoke sculptures, from my perspective at least, and two roots of them, and also what I think they're doing now. So one root of Judy Chicago's smoke sculptures is in a performance from 1968 It was called Disappearing Environments. At dusk, illuminated by the pink glow of road flares, stacked ziggurat cubes of dry ice slowly turned to vapor. And over the course of many hours, they melted completely. It was the riskiest thing she could have done at the time. That was to create a monument that didn't leave a trace. Because then the greatest impact was not in the thing itself, but in its impression. And like a rumor, or perhaps like a secret, the work gained its form through the lightness of whispers. Disappearing Environments was a collaboration with Eric Orr and Lloyd Hamrell, and it was staged on the grounds of a shopping mall, and that consumer context was not lost on Chicago, because something she was trying to disappear too was the overarching influence of patriarchy, and the way that she had already observed it was bound up with land and environmental art. The giant earth-moving works that defined land art weren't so much monuments to the land as to the men who had made them. And they can't be seen as separate from those artists and what they were projecting onto place, conveniently framing land as empty or a blank canvas without history when it's anything but. And with her atmospheres, Chicago explained that she was trying to resist the macho Los Angeles art world, and she had fashioned itself as its foil. And with the creation of the Fresno Feminist Art Program in 1970, her practice became more and more collective, centering women's stories, voices, bodies, particularly elements of the body like menstruation that have been deemed taboo. And this collective practice carried over to her atmospheres as well. And she remarks that she was seeking to soften or feminize the land, if only for a few minutes. She was also placing women at the center of it. Her collaborators included artists like Faith Wilding, and their bodies were painted in shades of deep red and bright green and purple and white, colors that she said contrasted with the smoke. And they became central figures in her early atmospheres. In one image, there's a woman with striking auburn hair, and she sits in a circle of smoldering white smoke. And then in another, she's engulfed in flaming red. And yet another, there's a group of women igniting orange flares in unison, the billow vapor contrasting brightly against the amber desert sand. I think of them as kind of elemental images, where women are the catalyst, and they are somehow flint to the fodder of patriarchy. And these works kind of disappeared from art history for a while too, not contextualized as radical gestures of land art, not even seen as an extension of minimalism. And her practice kind of existed at the edges of these movements, even if she had helped define them. Yet I think there's more to these images than inscribing this elemental relationship between the body and land, because she was also trying to criticize art institutions as well. For example, at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, she ignited a sculpture of yellow and orange smoke along the museum's walls. And for a moment, the institution looked like it had gone up in flames. And she said, and she's good at these one-liners, she said, but because of course museums aren't exactly hospitable to women artists. And I think they're becoming a little more hospitable now. But there's another kind of quieter origin to the smoke sculptures too, and these were performances that were largely solitary. They existed along California's north coast, and they were up crevasses among trees and grasses on the rocky shore of a creek alongside a canyon. There she lit flares of colored pigment. Her northwest coast atmospheres, kind of similar to this one, took place between 1970 and 1975, and they only exist as photographs, and that was her goal. What was a bit different about these images is that they were all inscribed by hand, like diaries of her process and her thinking at the moment. She writes that the sites were chosen based on how they were a perfect fit for the softness of her smoke. And whenever she saw an appropriate setting, they would park, walk around, look, take test shots, and finally burrow into the environment for a few minutes. change the atmosphere, and move on. So she describes the process of changing the atmosphere quite simply, but their effect was more complex, I think, because the wisps of color look something like an apparition, and in others, they look like dust clouds from falling rock. Where the Santa Barbara Museum atmosphere was aggressive, these are gentle. They caressed the land with color, and they shrouded it with pigmented fumes. She's since returned to the medium, and with that, her gestures have grown larger. She often utilizes staggered scaffolding to enable her pigments to mix in the air at even greater heights. And these scaffolds, I think, for me, harken back to the ziggurats of her disappearing environments, the ascending forms that are the basis of ancient temples, of forms of worship, of the architecture of the sacred. In Tribute to Toronto, which was from 2022, her focus shifted from the land to the water. And this one was realized atop a barge of Lake Ontario, tethered a few hundred feet from shore, and her palette was a mix of rich purple, deep blue, emerald green, yellow, and white. And it was based in response to the lake, one of the largest freshwater ecosystems in the world. The smoke sculpture was lit just before dusk, with red flares along the barge's edge first, the lowest tier of the scaffold. Their hissing was audible from shore. And then slowly purple smoke radiated up from a tier a few feet above with remarkable density of color. And then the pigment traced the direction of the wind, marking first its languid trail upward, then its gusts enveloped the crowd in a hazy color field. I think she was not so much changing the atmosphere as rendering it visible. Soon purple mixed with blue, and as each subsequent layer was ignited, new hues emerged out of the clouds. And as it reached its crest, lines were lit along the top of each side of the structure, and the palette was inverted. But the performance didn't end when the smoke cleared, because just then a cluster of fireworks ignited, arcing out of the top of the scaffold, and the cloud collectively gasped, because this was its climax, literally and figuratively at this moment. And for me, it was then clear that the ziggurat, of course, was a temple to the female body. So I'd like to invite both Torkwase and Joan to join me here on stage as we have an unfolding conversation about women, the environment, and your particular works, and your relationship also to feminism and the feminist movement. And you're each going to share some of your work with us as well. So thank you. Torkwase to speak first because she had a response to some of Judy's work here and a couple of images that you chose to share with us.
Sure. Thank you, Candice. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for everyone at the New Museum who's so generously brought me here, and I'm very glad to see you and meet you in person, Joan. So in this sort of time of great precarity, I took very seriously what I would share with everyone tonight. And I think that it's a time for poetry. So I centered my work around some writings that I've been doing lately and bringing and invoking some Black feminist poets to sort of frame the artwork. So can we progress to one slide and I'll share with a piece. Can we move the slide forward? Yeah. So when I think about Judy Chicago's atmospheric work, I definitely am inspired to think about the relationship between desire and obliteration. So I'm going to share this poem. It's entitled Sing. Judy Chicago, Work in the Unfreedom. The bad ancestors are welcome here. the brutal ones, the unruly ones, the burn it down ones, the beyond ones. This painting is a reception for them, a salute to the unfavorable, a greeting for the intolerable, from ash to dust, the surface of an edge. I open a space to forge. I open space for the forbidden. This painting is made of haunted air, of death in quiet eyes. The gaze expels and disavows. This disobedience, the terrain of power, from here to refusals, hailing from the sky. A cunning downpour, a new distance arrives. The canvas is now a black hole, where the horizon is a blood red, where all lines are for madness, exhausting shape and distance. The expanse is yours, my arms all possibilities. These marks are not made for your kind parts. They are for the riot in you. They are composed for your thunder. Yellow is for the breach. I scrape and pound to flourish. My palms drenched in ink. I am a wild one. Every glimmering touch an open form. This bolt of light is for the disagreeable, for liberated lumens. At every scale, I make space for you. Evoking the great ancestor bell hooks, I acknowledge that in this condition of white supremacy, patriarchy, death is always uncertain, and this means we are not free. That said, I enter this conversation proposing that in Chicago's work, the specter and the spectator are one, that they live in what Ronaldo Walcott explores as the non-emancipation. In this atmosphere of unfreedom or non-emancipation, Judy Chicago opens up a free flow of expression and articulation of state change, precarity, and space. What of architectures and infrastructures of dispossession? And how do we world build from geographies that are our own bodies? Yes, when the specter and the spectator are one, they must forge, make new formations, and world build. What are forms in the unfreedom? Is liberation a form while self lives, is liberation a form where the self lives in phenomenon and the quotidian, a space between obliteration and desire to exhaust the possibility of the senses, color as form, space as material, where certainty is a cruel illusion of hypercapitalism, and we all live without the promise of stability. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. What we had thought about doing was, each of you sharing a bit about your practice, and Torkwase, I know you have an example, but perhaps before we move there, because you've offered so many openings, I think, in what you shared, these kind of hauntings, this idea that the specter and the spectator actually might collapse into one form, it's perhaps a nice opening to your work, Joan. I know that you have some videos you wanted to share with us, and I thought it would be nice to witness those together, and I think you were going to introduce them for us as well.
A little bit. I mean, there's several videos, and the first one is called Wind, which is about a 7-minute video, and the second is Organic Honey, and the third, then some work of most recent work, which involves the environment. But I'll show them, and I'll maybe say a few words as they show. So this was filmed on the coldest day of the year. Yeah. I had been working with mirrors and made these mirror costumes. And it's called Wind. And I can say that wind, ever since there, has been part of my work. And I always, if I'm in the country and it's windy, I rush out with my flowing robes or whatever, and use the wind, let the wind animate me and animate the scene. And this was based on an indoor work, but it was quite developed for this wind. I was influenced by early French films, which people wore all black costumes and were climbing up and down walls. And it's definitely a kind of ritual outdoors. This was the first performance I did of a piece called Organic Honey's Visual Telepathy. And the point of this piece, it's quite an extensive piece that I worked on for 2 years, but the point, how it began was I was questioning what is the female, because everybody in the early 70s, late 60s was talking about male and female, and the male being long poles and the female being, or the moon and the sun, each representing, and I was just trying to explore that. What is the female? And of course, along with that was there were no men in the performance, but which was part of it, and it was a solo performance, and I had masks and costumes. I'd been to Japan. I was influenced by the No drama, in which masks play a major part, and other things, which I can mention later. But so I named the character Organic Honey, and the name of the piece was Organic. And this is one of my latest pieces, which I was asked to do a project about the ocean, a huge subject, by Utameta Bauer, in relation to an organization, TBA 21, that's formed to try to save the ocean, an impossible task, but to bring attention to the ocean. And these are some scenes from that project. I worked with a marine biologist, David Gruber, for part of this, and I also went to many aquariums and photographed and videotaped. But I also worked with children because one of the purposes of having children was to say that this is what's happening to our environment, and the children are going to inherit this. I mean, they didn't have to deal with that content, but they did see all these images, and I also wanted them to, I want children to know what we are losing, or what, I want everybody to know, everybody should know, but what are we losing now? And I'm sorry you can't hear her, So at first I just had the children performing, and then I gave them, she's not a child, she's a young woman by now. And these are shots in which the children are performing in the projections of the landscape and the water and the sea. And myth is a major part of my language, the history of myth, and it's in all of the early work, even though it's not said. That is my structure of studying mythology from many cultures, and then having it enter the work on my terms or in my way, but not copying it. And in this case, the first thought, thinking about the oceans, I thought, what is the major myth of the ocean? Well, one of them is the mermaid. And so the mermaid became one of the references, and underwater. And then, of course, fish. And I studied fish and became, learned that they are sentient beings. I mean, I should have known that before, but they are sentient beings. Anyway.
Thank you, Joan, for that. I've been spending the last, and Torkwase, if you want to come back, join us. I've been spending the last few days immersed in both of your work. And Joan, I was wondering, you shared with us Wind, early work of yours. I was going back to some of the things that you said about the feminist movement when you were involved. You were saying that in one interview in the late 60s and early 70s, you said the feminist movement exploded. You said anger was a positive driving force. New technology gave women a new way of expression. And during that time, our friendships altered. This was a time of women talking, becoming more open, sharing how they were represented, revealing their position. You said, my work developed against this background. I became involved in the roles women play. One thing that I noticed is that there's a lot of role play in your early videos. There's a lot of masking. There's a lot of costuming. I was wondering first if you could share more about that period with us.
Difficult, so much. How do I begin? I mean, it was a major, it was a movement that was really important to women and changed. It changed, even the men also who were aware were involved in that movement, changing the relationship between men and women. I mean, it took a long time and it's still not totally solved at all, and there are other issues. But it was a time of opening up and feeling quite free to invent and to go to new places. It didn't, I mean, I know about the monuments that you mentioned in the desert, you know, that were, yes, made by men. But it's true that, I mean, I think Judy's work is important because she was so strong in her position to declare herself as a feminist and to change her name, and she did many things and brought to light so many other women artists. She was on the West Coast, I was on the East Coast, so we were not in touch with each other all the time. But it was a very important moment. It's hard to know how to. For me in New York, it was, I worked with the dancers, who were many women dancers, so the world of dance was really open to women. And so it's one of the reasons I shifted from the art world. I didn't shift, but to go into the dance world was, as a woman, a more welcoming world, put it that way. It's true that the women were not asked to be in the museums and so on and so forth. I don't know if that tells you a little bit.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I have more to say, but I wanted to turn to Torkwase for a minute. Torkwase, you know, I was struck by a recent talk that you gave at the Art Institute of Chicago. You were saying that, you know, you were saying, following Christina Sharp, that you've talked about how your work is made in the wake of being. You said whether that's colonialism, white supremacy, or the afterlives or current lives of imperialism, I'm adding now the bodily economy, transatlantic slave trade, and so on. What kind of wake or being or atmosphere are you producing in now? Can you go deeper into that? I wonder, how does being a Black woman, you know, influence that in any way, influence your work?
Well, I think keeping with sort of a tradition of what does it mean to create liberation in the unfreedom, in the space of the unfreedom, and I really believe in that. So as we sort of are born into a struggle, Sylvia Winter, we're born into these struggles, but our job, or my job, is to make liberation inside of it. And in that making, in that creative process, the determination to exhaust the possibility of my senses, that's my responsibility in relationship to form, right? So these sort of conditions of things that dull the senses, my job is to exhaust the senses. Conditions that create a sort of fixed condition of being, my condition is to work towards my true self, not against that demand, but to work towards my true self, which inherently refuses that demand to be fixed, right? And so that's where I am in my own condition of being. in making. Is that creativity to the extent of the unknown, of the unexplainable, of the sort of beyond language space. That's what I'm interested in the work.
Thank you for that. I was thinking about an affinity, this desire to be unfixed, I think is also a part of Joan's work too. I feel like in your work, you've never been satisfied with any fixed representations. And you've also said that you want to resist any kind of binaries or even, simple kind of meanings to what you're doing. I felt like both of yours are kind of myriad worlds that you're creating that are reflected, refracted, and displaced, where time and space are often not fixed, but these places of productive oscillation. I feel like, Joan, your work with mirrors does this, and mirroring as a technique. I was reminded as well about how, some of your early interventions with your mirror pieces enabled you to temporarily intervene in the landscape and place the body within it. But a fractured body, not necessarily a whole one. It wasn't a self-portrait, for example, because there was also a reflection of us in that too. I wondered if you could speak to that kind of, that uneasiness with any fixed representations. You always have, these layers of images that happen even in this performance that you just shared with us there.
I think I could say that I didn't approach any of that work with a plan, because so I didn't say, oh, I'm going to be fractured now, but what I did was, I chose certain props. I was inspired by Borges, the writer Borges, and my ideas for using mirrors came from Borges. So I also looked at other cultures and literature, and I drew from particularly Borges in this case, and his whole idea of the infinity and the multiple libraries that go on. I just loved his work. And so that took me through that inspired the mirror pieces. And then once I had, the mirrors and the video, well, the video came later. It was mirrors first. Then by using the mirrors, I found what you were just mentioning, the fracturing and the breaking up of the space. So it's all about space. My main concern, I would say, was space. I'd go to a space and sit and look at it and have the mirrors walking around, because people would carry the mirrors. And so my ideas came from the process. Yeah, and then of course it led to other things. And then the characters, I immediately loved performing when I started doing it. So I enjoyed getting dressed up and acting weirdly in front of an audience. I also thought we could later on talk about, I've been reading about your show, about the idea that you had, the idea, I would like to know more about the idea of the circle, and also the idea of a new relationship between and the performer that you mentioned, and you'll probably think about that too, I don't know, but I'm curious because, well, whatever, yeah.
Those are good questions. We've got them marked. The idea, what Joan is referencing, is an exhibition that recently closed at the Center for Curatorial Studies called Indian Theater, Native Performance, Art, and Self-Determination since 1969, that was based on a document also called Indian Theater from 1969, that was produced out of the Institute of American Indian Art, and it became a kind of treatise on what Native performance might be. And one of the characteristics that they were proposing for Native performance, that it of course not be lineal, but it be cyclical, so that the end is the beginning, and perhaps that's deeply embedded, I think, in many indigenous concepts of time. That it's definitely not linear. There's no kind of beginning or end, but we see things relative, right? Always in relation. That's what a circle is essentially, is a space of relation. But I didn't want to lose this idea of the mirror, because there's a link, I think, to Torkwase, to your work, and one image that you wanted to share with us, an installation recently completed for Desert X. And when you first proposed that work, you proposed that it actually be a reflective surface, and then you changed your mind. So I was wondering if you could speak about, how that shift happened and why, and also why you wanted it to be reflective initially and what that was going to show in that landscape.
Sure. Sort of picking up on Borges and this idea of the forking paths, right? So in the work, philosophically, I'm interested in throughways, I'm interested in multiples, I'm interested in this sort of measurable idea of space, but also the quanta. And I think this Borges position on multiple paths and the imagination is what I like to bring into the work, where there are multiple entrances, there's no sort of front or back, there's this idea of an all-encompassing, all-around experience that the viewer can have, and multiple entry points and multiple exit points. And that in the work, the body becomes the instrument and the tool, right? The body becomes the geography of the architecture and the sculpture. So when I initially thought about it having a reflective surface, meaning that I could create a condition of a void, right? That this idea of what comes out of the void, what comes out of the negative and positive space and sort of disappears. And what are you asking of the subject who embodies this particular sculpture to reveal from their own interest in space as material, if that makes sense, right? So it's a discursive condition. A viewer walks up, there are multiple entry points, multiple exit points. You go above and below, or you don't enter at all, but there's a sort of a spatial conundrum that one is faced with that you can either experience sort of in its meditation way, in a meditative way, in a monastic way, or you can experience it as a sort of syncopation, a work of syncopation, where you bring music and movement into it. And getting and sort of distilling the mirrors off of the object and creating a sort of black surface that from above almost looks like a hole, right? Almost looks like a space. So that condition of the whole and the hold in relationship to how does one free oneself from the condition of a hold sort of operated poetically in that work. So it was, it evolved from being in the space, experiencing the sun, working in the desert, the material not quite doing what I wanted to do in relationship to sort of disappearing a space. But also, I wanted the work to have echoes of liquidity, right? So all of these rock formations are formed because of the history of liquid on our planet. And sort of creating a sort of matte surface, I think brought in, again, that our bodies are the liquid in the room, that we're bringing liquid into these spaces. So that was a decision. It was pretty immediate when I started to see the reflective surfaces. It became more about, for me, a sort of immediate response to, I'm the subject, this is my reflection, what can I do? And so I veered away from that to something a bit more indeterminable, right?
Thanks for describing that. Made me think a little bit about, also, you said echoes of liquidity, and I was thinking about, the encounter with the sculpture, but then the encounter with the desert as well, which is a reminder, as you just said, that those, rocks at one time were also malleable, they were also liquid. That's a kind of form of geologic witnessing, I think. I feel like, Joan, you spend a lot of time witnessing in your work. Not all of that is evident. I think it comes evident in your performances. Since the 1970s, you've spent time in Cape Breton, east coast of Canada, and you've spent time both in and proximate to the water. So I was wondering if you were interested in sharing with us how that has shaped your practice, how that deep engagement, how that kind of hydrological way of being informs your practice now. You know, that last piece that you showed us is literally called moving away, moving off the land, you know. So you're moving off the land and you're moving on into the water, you're moving into liquid space.
Well, Cape Breton, where I go in the summer, I'm very lucky to be able to go there. Hello. I was interested when I first went there. I was very involved with Celtic culture, you know, and I identified with it, you know, the stories, the poetry, the magic, superstitions. Everybody in Cape Breton, they still believed in ghosts, which I found really, I wanted to enter into that world. And I love ghost stories. And so it was a very inspiring place for me. And I can't, I'm a little different in that, okay, I'm just get up and go out there and do crazy things on the lawn in front of my house and hope my neighbors don't show up. No, but really, so the landscape became my performing space, and I went into it alone with my own fantasy of who I was, but it was mostly based on, it's hard to say, but it was based on our early study of witches, you know, and how women once were seen, and they were healers, actually. They called them witches, but they were healers, and they were outside of the culture. So I was just involved in that kind of mythology, and that landscape, which is very magical and beautiful, inspired me. And I can only say that I did a lot of work there. I owe so much of my work to Cape Breton and to the people there. They didn't enter into my performance, but they, the old people still were involved in their, you know, ancient stories. The young people, not so much. But I meet young people now who still believe in ghosts, and they're still involved in that mythology. I don't know if that explains it, but.
Well, I wanted to just describe when I first witnessed moving off the land at Ocean Space, which is a space in Venice. And what I realized after experiencing that piece is that what you're doing, I think, to a degree, is you're creating ecological environments. I remember there was a kind of modest table of books, and I was looking at all the books. Some of them were about how octopuses think in multiplicities, and I understood that there was this kind of generosity of knowledge that you were sharing with us, a kind of bibliography that would shape soon what we would soon see. And then there were these series of intimate encounters, very singularly, with single channel videos that all offered kind of a way to go, you know, beyond the surface, into these depths of this hydrological world. But then I realized as I looked above that we were actually already in the water, because above were hanging were a series of paintings that you've made. You've made a lot of these paintings of fish, but they were installed in lines, and they were installed in lines because each of them was marking the depths of the ocean. So in fact, we were already there. We were already in the water. And so that was quite an extraordinary experience. And then you went around the wall and you heard a soundscape, and the soundscape was the discourse of sperm whales communicating with one another. And they do that over the wavelengths of the water. And I know from what I understand about how whales communicate is that they go to certain depths because that's the frequency they need to achieve to speak to one another.
Yeah, it's true. Right now I'm working with whales, so my head just sort of, I'm working with a sperm whale, not with a whale, but I find it also heartbreaking, because this world is in danger. But what I did, I found a book of Japanese fish in a bookstore in San Diego, and that became my little Bible. it was a textbook, but beautiful little drawings. And so I spent a lot of time copying those, making those drawings. And so the drawings that you saw were all from this book about fish from that part of the world. And then so it's step by step. I was on my way to Japan, and I was thinking, God, the Japanese eat so much fish. And so I made an installation of 100 drawings of fish. So it's just, I went into the world, basically, and it was very hard to give it up, which I haven't. I'll just say one thing, that one of my, I don't know if this answers your question, but one of my improvisations and filming myself was diving with the seals in an aquarium. Whenever I went, I took my camera everywhere. When I went to a city, I would find the aquarium or whatever was there. Anyway, so I spent a lot of time dancing, running back and forth in the projection with the seals. And I have to say, after that project was over, it was a strange feeling because it's just virtual and it's video and it's just projection, but it actually altered for a while. I've lost it now because I'm not doing it. It altered my relation to my immediate surroundings, and I felt like I was in that world. And so that's part of my desire, to go into the world.
Well, I felt like I was part of that world for a minute when I was there, or the few hours that I spent there. Torkwase, I know that you think about this too. You said that, in this moment of environmental precarity, we will need to be both liquid and mountain, bird and lava. And it is this density of Black grace that will keep us in our own humanity. You said we need to draw ourselves into invention. This is the form as practice of liberation. I wondered if you could speak more to that, to this, how you're navigating this. You're not navigating environmental precarity through a kind of classic form of resistance, because it's both, right? You're saying both liquid and mountain, both bird and lava. You're saying, you're talking about densities that contribute to the sense of humanity.
Sure. That's a project titled Bird and Lava. And oftentimes I write, and then the forms sort of happen towards that writing, or projects happen towards that writing. And when I put that on the page, I knew, and something that I hadn't intuited before, but when you put something on a page and you see it, it becomes so concrete, that I needed to work in the discursive. I needed to work far beyond singularity, that I needed to sort of hop around different atmospheres and forms and conditions of matter on the planet. And oftentimes I'm also a diver, so I spend a lot of time thinking about extraction points, a lot of times thinking about oceans as superhighways and trying to understand water as a built environment. And so when I think about bird and lava, I think about most of the volcanoes are actually underwater. Most of our birds that migrate across great distances with water. So I'm glad I said that where that project pushed me into a discursive place, pushed me into the politics of liquidity, but also pushed me into the politics of distance, and distance as a subject in relationship to time and space. So how do we talk about, from what we know about time and space and all of the art that's done around time, space, and light, maybe the politic now is to take what we know from the light space movement and these sort of materials, and then think about how to put the subject of distance at the center of these conceptual frameworks. Thinking about migration, forced or not, thinking about trade, forced or not, thinking about justice, equality, and liberations as people are forced to move great distances. And in that, both bird and lava, the molten of the lava and the swiftness of the bird, and how does time and improvisation together produce and acknowledge these moments of liberation that we have to hold on to.
Joan, did you want to respond to that? Did you? You're shaking your head. Did you want to respond to it? No?
Nodding out of interest. Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up, Torkwase, with what I thought was this beautiful idea of resistance. You said that we need to change register in relation to extraction zones. Those things that might not be visible, you've talked about. Extraction, is inherently a form of alienation from the land. It's turning those places into places of protection. I feel like your work is also changes register. Feels like it's not fixed in some. You use glass. You use, overly like thick surfaces in what you do. Do you think that your work does that? Is it about changing registers?
I hope so. I think that the politic of the discursive exists in acknowledging how conditions of scale have power, how conditions of the haptic have power, how conditions of being able to use space as form has power. So if you think about form in relationship to scale, whether it's a small moment in the side of a painting or a large condition of a fleeting monument, scale is not always our friend, right? So we have to ask, how do we manipulate conditions of scale in relationship to our own liberation? And how do we desire, ask about scalar systems that can change a complete condition of sociality, but also can change my individual solitary moment of expression, right? So where you go out and you're making work as a singular being, sentient being, where you're connected to this biosphere, that has power and scale. And so does these large sociality moments where Judy brings in these performers and collaborative moments, and that has a power. And to be able to move between, that's the work for my work I do in the studio. Like the practice is, how do you move between scales? How do you act in these sort of surface textures? And how do you bring these tensions into the paintings or the sculptures or the performances that allows the viewer to have a subjective experience that invokes these kinds of questions?
Yeah, you've said that scale can evoke it's a critical factor in your work because it evokes a critical body politic. This might be another form of a body politic, Joan, that you've never abandoned the human body as an explicit part of the ecological system. And, it's part of the layers, it's part of the performances that you do now. It becomes almost like an ecological praxis, I think. But I think increasingly, what you're showing us is the lack of boundary, right? We always want to kind of create these boundaries, and I think that you always place yourself right within that. I was curious about the role of performance lately for you. As your work becomes more liquid, as your work becomes more invested in the water, are you developing performances now in relation to the water?
I'm developing a video piece. I mean, right now I'm working on something that takes all my time. So for me to do, I don't do that many performances, but I can say that I find my work in my body. Like, I mean, what am I going to do? I set up a little stage and I get on it. And then the work comes out of all parts of the body, the intellect, but it comes from the body. I really believe that. I mean, it's a very simple thing to say, I know, and it comes, and I'm very interested in how other people work and move, and dancers and performers from other cultures are a big influence on me. My travel is a big influence on me to find things from places that are not from my own immediate surroundings are inspiring. I don't know if that answers your question, but
I think so. I wondered if you could speak more about some of those collaborations. We were speaking before the panel about, your work with Ande Sombi, who's not only he's a Sami lawyer, who's also an incredible yoiker. But I think that, that practice that he has, that many people share, is also environmental. And you've increasingly started working with, scientists and all of these folks that you're bringing into your orbit. Kind of collaborations are you working on now?
I work with the people in my studio. I've just invited, I don't know, a couple of dancers to enter. Ishmael Houston Jones is going to be in my next piece, and I've never worked with him before, but I saw a work of his last year that I really liked. And then I worked with Emily Coates, another dancer. And I have to say, I'm hovering on the edge of something that I can't work with. I saw, this is a piece about whales. And so I wanted to work with David Gruber, to continue to work with him. And so what he does is he gives me footage, and then we talk about the sea life, and he's a marine biologist. So those are the elements. And then poetry. I'm working with a poem by Pablo Neruda, which is a very beautiful poem. It's called Ode to Things. And so those are the ingredients. I'm just saying, I don't usually explain to a large audience what my latest ingredients are. Please don't tell anybody. But that's how I begin. And so it's like, for me, cooking has always been a metaphor for work, is how do you put things together, and then a chemical reaction happens when they come together and interact.
Yeah, I think that's like Torkwase's idea too of, working beyond kind of singularity and increasing collectivity to your work. One thing that I was thinking about, since the first thing that we spoke about was about feminism. Torkwase, one story that I was inspired by, one history that I was inspired by, is a history of Black women refusing. And you spoke about a woman who was on an auction block, which well predated the idea of feminism. And even on that block, she refused. And your drawing was a way of bringing forward, her story, and how her story can perhaps shape our understanding of feminism now. I think that what you're doing too is stretching back this historical trajectory so that it can encompass many, many resistances, right? I was wondering if there were other forms of resistances that you're working with in your drawing, or other women's stories that you're bringing forward.
That's a big question, because it's a question of inheritance, right? So I'm kind of drenching, I'm soaked in this sort of inheritance of Black women freedom fighters. And I think the best way to answer that question is to say that in the studio, at least when I'm making the paintings, I am aware that when the canvases are on the ground and the water goes on top and these layers of washes happen, that's where the meditation is. That's where the ask to continue. That's where the ask for patience and fire come from. So I think, to evoke Audre Lorde, oh my goodness, so many, where do I begin? Betty Parker Smith, Dionne Brand, D. Soyini Madison. There's so many spaces to go. I'll be really acute about this, right? So most recently I've been thinking and listening to Alice Walker. And what Alice Walker has been teaching me in her own Buddhist meditation practice is that my job is to be my natural self, my true self. And to get at that is labor, and that I should not have to always do, right? But we are born into the struggle and we do it anyway. So when I find in the work a space in the interstitial between the work I'm forced to do and the work my natural self does, that's where I think sort of a Black feminist politic lie, just in that interstitial space where I continue to find the beauty, I continue to find my senses, I continue to lock arms with other women who have life's meaning as a goal for articulating friendships and food and community. So, bringing meaning out of that into the work is important to me. So that's a really difficult question to ask because it's surrounding me now. And I'll bring it back to Judy's work and thinking about atmosphere and thinking about this moment on the bridge and these interstitial spaces. Like that is a moment that I find, how do I extend the rigor of the work? How do I extend the rigor of the practice? Is looking at pieces like Atmospheric Bridge and saying that there is a space for beauty in the precarity. There is a space for beauty in the ephemera. There is a space for kind of dangerous beauty that pushes against oppression and dispossession. And in that beauty, as long as we can find it, do it, and see it, and it speaks back to us, I think that Black womanist position is always there to be heard in the work.
Thank you for that. You've said that dangerous beauty pushes colonization. And for me, that was very inspiring too. This resistance in things that might be beautiful or seductive, for example. I find that, your surfaces of your work are very, very seductive because it kind of pulls you in and it kind of keeps you there. I wonder, a final question before we turn to the audience. My phone, it's kind of funny, speaking of time being cyclical, it's not even cyclical on my phone because it's permanently 6:44. So I have no idea what time it is, but that's okay. Joan, we spoke earlier about the importance of unsettling, and I think that what we were talking about too is ecocide and genocide go hand in hand. They can't be separated, and it's one of the crises of the moment. I think that you, in your work, try to take a kind of careful touch to these questions, but also talk about our inherent entanglements. And I feel like in your practice too, there's less and less of a kind of border between, your body and a fish's body, for example, let's say. I was wondering about that idea of unsettling, or what you might find in your work that's that place of danger, let's say, that productive place of danger.
I often am drawn to other cultures, but of course I can't use what I see because it's not mine. And I think particularly, I'll just talk about tonight and thinking about your show, which I saw at Bard, it was wonderful, and reading and thinking that I'm the settler, I come from the settler, and that's what we're dealing with now, and it's a metaphorical and a real situation in many places. So so I began to immediately think of the landscape in a different way, a little bit different way. I mean, it won't change my work, but it's something that I should have been aware of it before. I mean, I knew of it in another way, but not with this word settler. So that's been real. And I saw the Hopi snake dance in the 60s, which had it was it's an amazing dance with, they hold the snakes in their mouths, and had an amazing, I just could never recover from that. But I could never bring it into my work. And so often I'm on that edge. Like the most recent one was, I saw a video piece on Channel 13 about the buffalo, and they've all, slaughtered. And the whales have all been slaughtered also, Moby Dick. It's just about murder, really. And that's another edge. And so I thought of, as a reference, but I can't, it's not going to be in my work, is the idea of the ghost dance, which recently anyway. So the ghost dance, the idea is very beautiful, but I cannot. On the other hand, I can have it in my mind, and it can affect me, but I would never, I'm mentioning it here publicly, but I wouldn't ever mention that publicly, except we're in this kind of situation of discussing this. So those are the edges some of the edges that I think about.
Thank you for that. 5 more, 10 minutes we have total, or with the audience or up here? Okay. No, that's very good. So we can turn to questions now. Yeah, we have 10 minutes left. And Austin is kindly going to circulate a microphone. We are recording, so we'd be grateful if you can use the mic. And we have time, I think, for 2 or 3 questions, if anyone. So, burning one. You can put your hand up. There's one at the very, very back corner. No? No. Right here. Right in the middle, Austin. If you can put your hand up again, with the mask. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here and talking about your work. In the beginning, you had mentioned about wanting to talk about the artist's relationship with the audience. And I'm just curious, because we talked a lot about collaboration in making things. I'm wondering, with regard to you as an artist and the audience and that relationship, could you each say something about what you find frustrating about it, but also where you find promise?
Immediately, I need the audience. I like the audience, and I'm scared of the audience, and the audience is challenging, and the audience should challenge you, because you think about what the audience is, right? You think about who's in the audience, and that's very important. And it can alter your way of thinking about your work if you think about the audience.
The audience, I don't necessarily think about the audience. It's paralyzing. I trust, that's as much as I think about it. You have to trust the audience, trust the curator.
I'll say also I keep a distance from the audience. I do. I keep a distance. I don't do interactive pieces with everybody on the stage and things like that, which are great, and people do that, but I keep a distance too.
Is there another question?
I think the phrase dangerous beauty is a really beautiful phrase to describe Judy Chicago's atmosphere pieces, because I don't know, I know her work. I'm a little embarrassed to say that I wasn't that familiar with those pieces, and when I first saw them, my response now was with more like kind of skeptical curiosity, but after you discuss it, I really see them very differently and more meaningfully. And I think it is that dangerous beauty, you know. And where's my question? I don't know. Like, how do it's like I see war, I see pollution, I see a lot of things that maybe she wasn't thinking about at that time, and I get that's there's no question there, but it's just that you really helped encourage a different response, a fuller response to those pieces. So thank you.
I pulled that phrase from an article my mother wrote. Her name is Dee Soyini Madison. And she was talking about, she's a performance ethnographer, and she was talking about ways in which refusal happens on stage in protest and resistance, that the things that we put on our bodies and our engagements have to, so what she would like that to exist at a level of beauty that pushes the dispossession away, that sort of stops these catastrophes. And it always, I invoke it, not only because my mother said it, but it's something that intuitively I know that I'm trying to get at in my studio. So I use it as a lens to write. I use it as a lens to make my paintings. I use it along with other lenses, but it functions in a direction for me that beauty is powerful, right? And the idea of certainty is overrated. And this idea of the sort of absolute condition, for me, the absolute condition of beauty in the studio is a driving force for me. So I know that there's a thing called beauty. I know when I feel it, I experience it. And oftentimes, when I see it at the scale of Chicago's work that happens over, definitely over my lifetime, there's a force there. And I think that that force comes from how beautiful these works are.
How simultaneously threatening they are too.
Absolutely. And what they evoke, I cannot look at atmosphere and bridge and not, because of the color, the idea of the bridge, the grayness, the soot. I can't look at that and not think about the catastrophes that are happening right now all over the world. So, but I needed to see it, and the landscape that is the body, the second image I chose. It's all about this perspective, but it's from a female body thinking about our bodies as geographies, right? And our bodies of these, our bodies in relationship to our own mobilities and freedoms. So I think that kind of beauty takes you into that refusal that I'm going to move, right? I'm going to love, I'm going to move, I'm going to make, I'm going to share, I'm going to commune, and I'm going to laugh and fight, you know.
I think we have time for one final question. Yeah, I think there was a hand. There's a few hands. In the burgundy sweater, yeah.
Thank you. I think I'm just curious in both of your works when you're dealing with, so sorry, I didn't realize I was holding it far. When you're dealing with these elements that aren't aging and you're talking about the effects of water and of wind, do you think about your own works aging socially and physically? You know, you're talking about mountains coming out of water, but, you know, do you think about the aging effects, the effect of aging on your own works? Of aging.
Absolutely.
I think about what I don't think about it quite like that. Like, I've been thinking about, as an abstract painter who looks at women who work in these different ranges or registers of abstraction, what I try to imagine is myself as an ancestor and other abstract women looking at this work after I'm dead. Like, what I think, I don't want to be misunderstood and I don't want to be confused. That does not mean that I present some kind of ultimate clarity in the work, but I do have a fidelity to questioning and pushing and asking and thinking about these histories. So as far as the work is aging, whoever is looking at this work when I'm sort of dead and gone, I just would like for it to be some kind of condition where they learn from it, like I learned from my own ancestors. So I just want to be in that trajectory. So the art object but institutions help with that, right? So I think about it in a very sort of conservative way in that way. Like, I know that when I look at some painter that's fantastic and they're an ancestor, I want that. Maybe I do think about audience then. I guess I think about audiences after I'm dead. And how might a young Black woman from Tougaloo College look at the painting and then read the tag and then say Torkwase Dyson, born in 1973 from Chicago, and then it propel them to possibility.
I think the main place to think about aging for me is the body, because our minds so far are okay. I don't know, maybe not tomorrow, but the mind, and then I think one has to, it's very important to look at work and to have younger friends and to keep a dialogue going and not to become isolated and to keep your work fresh. I don't know, young is not the right word, but fresh and to not ever rest, actually. It keeps you alive. The work keeps you going.
Perhaps by way of closing with this productive question. Oh, sorry. I think that was the final one. One thing that I would like to think about is a future when each of your works become inheritances. It's not about aging, but I think it's about inheritances. So thank you both again for sharing what you did with us tonight.
Yes.
Amazing.